Chapter 3 Sonia from the Bronx. Although I grew up in very modest and challenging circumstances, I consider my life to be immeasurably rich. Sonia was born on June 25, 1954, in the heart of the Bronx in New York City, at Flower Fifth Avenue Hospital, where her grandma, Abuelita Mercedes, would die more than 40 years later. Born in New York, but with Puerto Rican roots, Sonia was instantly a New Yorican. Tall red brick buildings, one after another, lined her street. Known as the projects, the apartments were government-subsidized housing for poor or low-income households. Sonia's family lived in a tenement and later moved to the Bronxdale houses on the better side of town. This was the place where Sonia's parents intended to raise their children, a new co-op neighborhood. In an affordable housing co-op, people can invest in and own a share of the apartment buildings with the down payment and monthly rent payments and get a tax break too. The more invested they are in their community, the more likely they are to help keep it up. That's the idea anyway. Back then, the Bronxdale houses were public housing for working-class families moving up a few miles from Yankee Stadium. To live in these projects during the 1950s and 1960s was a dream come true, but that's not to say that everything was perfect. People from all walks of life ventured to the area. There were a variety of different ethnic and religious backgrounds represented. The people who lived there enjoyed that community had to offer. Good schools, parks, stores, libraries, a post office, a fire station, and restaurants. Still, danger lurked nearby. There were working poor in the projects, Sonia said. There were poor in the projects. There were sick poor in the projects. There were addicts and non-addicts and all sorts of people, every one of them with problems, and each group with a different response, different methods of survival, different reactions to the adversity they were facing, and you saw kids making choices. One of those kids was Nelson, Sonia's cousin, who was more like a soulmate. Sonia saw him get lured into drugs as they grew older and saw his potential disintegrate. He fell into the negative statistics of the Bronx. The images in movies, the news, or on television gave the impression that the Bronx was gang and drug-infested. Sometimes the image was not far from the truth. Of the 5 boroughs in New York, the Bronx stood out for 3 things. It had the most Latinos, mostly Puerto Ricans and Dominicans, the biggest Spanish-speaking population, and the highest poverty level. The Bronx contained one of the 5 poorest congressional districts in the United States, but it also included some of the most affluent, including upper and middle-income neighborhoods such as Riverdale, Fieldston, Pelham Gardens, Morris Park, and Country Club. In the late 1960s and the 1970s, there was a sharp decline in livable housing and quality of life. Challenges always reared up. Temptations to go down the wrong path when both parents worked, like Sonia's did, in order to put food on the table and a roof over their heads, could be found at every street corner. Sonia never thought of herself as a minority because most of her neighborhood was Hispanic. Puerto Ricans in her neighborhood had a pioneering spirit, presumably because they left worse tenements or poverty back on the island. Sonia became adept at learning street smarts and survival skills as she maneuvered Southern Boulevard, the center of her childhood universe. Seeing the very best of both worlds, American and Latina, is what Sonia loved most about her life in the Bronx. But she had to stay on her toes, and luckily, she also had her family to protect her. Family influence. Surrounded by a strong-willed mother, a large extended family, and Puerto Rican roots that meant family was in her business, Sonia was accountable for every day of her young life. There was nothing she could do or say that wouldn't get back to her family. As a girl in that time and place, she had curfews and chaperones. Sonia took it as a matter of fact and didn't mind. Sonia played with her many cousins and friends. If they roamed the streets, come nightfall, there was always curfew. She had to be indoors by a certain time. Her boy cousins, however, had fewer restrictions and could get into more trouble. Her cousin Nelson was like a brother to her. Because she was a girl, she couldn't go outside like he could. Over time, he got caught up in the world of drugs. Watching him spiral into that darkness brought a great deal of pain to the family and to Sonia, who felt helpless. While they were young, however, there were excitements of living on those streets too, and bringing the best of her Puerto Rican roots to life with her New York City home. In the Bronx, the lilt of Spanish punctuated the air everywhere they went. The best thing was living in close proximity to the rest of her family. She and her cousins walked to her abuela's apartment, which was always brimming with heavenly smells of Puerto Rican food. They sat at the window in her apartment and made faces at people getting on the elevated number 5 train. They also ventured out to watch Spanish movies starring the Mexican comedian Cantinflas. Even though he was not Puerto Rican, he brought a certain pride and connection to Hispanic communities. Sonia loved hanging out with her grandma. Her abuelita believed in God and family just like Sonia, but she also believed in traditions and curses and natural remedies, and often believed that she could cure Sonia's diabetes. Parties at her grandmother's were lively, with dozens of family members crammed into small apartments, eating mounds of delicious Puerto Rican food. A Yankee game could vie for airtime, playing loudly on television in the adjoining living room, with the lovely beat of salsa and merengue, music blasting from open windows. The richness of this culture was sometimes lost on others who weren't familiar with Puerto Rican living. The struggle at home. Sonia's parents were hard workers. While her father worked at the factory, her mother worked as a telephone operator at Prospect Hospital, a small private hospital in the South Bronx. Later, she received her practical nurse's license and continued to work as a nurse. Her parents' financial struggles and personal problems forced Sonia to be a caretaker to herself and her brother. Sometimes Junior got on her nerves, though. One day she'd had enough. She took him by the hand and led him outside to the hallway and left him there. She went back into the apartment and locked the door behind her. He stayed in the hallway until her parents came home, and then she got in trouble for it. But if he or any of her friends were ever picked on by others at school or in the neighborhood, she wouldn't stand for it. Sonia couldn't stand bullies and always stood up for the underdog, though Junior could be annoying. Sonia believed only she was allowed to pick on him. Even though they were poor, her family ensured that Sonia knew that everyone had to support everyone else. They had each other's backs. Her extended family watched out for her when her hard-working mother and father couldn't be there for her and Junior. Though overworked and worried about money to keep sending Sonia and Junior to Catholic school, Selena and Juan were willing to make sacrifices to give their children an opportunity to have a better education. Yet it took a toll. All Sonia could remember of her father and mother was their fighting. It wasn't until she was much older that she learned that there had been a true romance at one time. Sonia knew her father suffered. His hands shook, which was one reason he couldn't give her the insulin injection she needed in the first place. She learned he was an alcoholic. It was difficult to live with someone with an addiction like that because it became the addiction of the family. The pain of the needle wasn't as bad as hearing her parents argue or seeing her father hurt. The whole situation became a turning point in Sonia's life. To escape the fighting of her parents, she disappeared to her room to read. Whether it was to dive deep into her studies or into the faraway make-believe worlds of Nancy Drew, she grew independent and found comfort in books and learning. Sonia knew in her heart that her parents loved her, but the sadness they caused was also real. She imagined a different life for herself. She pictured herself alongside Nancy Drew like a sidekick, solving mysteries, being a sleuth, acting as the best of detectives because she had a good mind and could solve problems logically. She loved TV too, especially comedies like I Love Lucy and The Three Stooges, and dramas like Perry Mason. Her studies became a productive escape. Sonia later said, "I've always felt that the support I've drawn from those closest to me had made a decisive difference between success and failure. Whatever their limitations and frailties, those who raised me loved me and did the best they knew how." Father's death devastates the family. One day, coming home from school, Sonia was greeted by her uncle with a somber face. He brought her and Junior to their aunt's home, where her mother and others were crying, and immediately Sonia knew it was her father. He had died from complications to his heart problems, made worse by his affliction with alcohol. He was only 42. Sonia was 9 years old. Juan's death devastated Sonia and her family. They all gathered at Abuelita's house. Her grandma had a deep belief in the spirit world, which scared Sonia and her cousins, but they respected her as she tried to communicate with that other world. She led in prayers to send her son into the next world, but to keep his spirit close. And although Sonia didn't believe in that part of her abuela's spiritual practices, it brought her some comfort. And so she grew up fatherless for the rest of her formative life. Selena became a single mom, raising Sonia and Juan Luis Jr. alone. With no savings stored away, she began working 6 days a week. Sonia and Junior's school, Blessed Sacrament, gave them a 2-for-1 deal and allowed Selena to pay less for tuition, which helped keep the children in Catholic education. The nuns seemed to disapprove of the family's situation, frowning on women who worked outside the home, but her mother pressed forward. The irony, of course, was that my mother wouldn't have been working such long hours if not to pay for the education she believed was the key to any aspirations for a better life, said Sonia. Struggling with 2 jobs and trying to deal with her grief, Selena grew distant and pulled away from Sonia and Junior. For a while, it felt as if Sonia had lost both parents, until she finally told her mother to knock it off. Then Selena Sotomayor became the role model Sonia needed. The role model. After Sonia's father died, her mother had to hustle. She realized she was alone and had to make a living and raise 2 young children. Besides working 2 jobs, she went back to school so that she could become a nurse and earn a better living. Once she reached her goal, Sonia's mother worked all day as a nurse to support Sonia and her brother. She also helped the people in their building and in the neighborhood. She was glad she already had a profession where she could support Sonia, but she wanted Sonia to support herself. Sonia didn't need much convincing. Sonia's mother knew the importance of an education and of dreaming big. Sonia and Junior never messed around with or questioned their mother's requirement that they never miss school or work. Sonia hated to miss school, but it was unavoidable when she was diagnosed with diabetes. That was the longest absence she ever had from school. Her mother, meanwhile, urged them to speak more English and speak it better. Watching her mother raise them gave Sonia a sense of independence. She focused more on her brains than on her looks. She actually always looked a little unkempt, with her unruly hair, her blouse sticking out of her school uniform, and her shoelaces untied. Luckily, getting into mischief and being sent to the principal's office didn't deter her from her love of education and learning either. Education was the highest priority. Selena saved enough to buy her children an Encyclopedia Britannica, a novelty in the projects, and became famous for the encyclopedia set. They opened a new world for Sonia, her brother, and their cousins and friends in the projects. The books offered hours of delight and research, awe and fascination. Sonia always knew she would have an occupation, not just a job, but a career. Her mother's drive helped her see the important steps to get there. Selena knew that Junior would go to college because it was a natural assumption and a sign of the times that boys did and girls didn't, but she pushed Sonia to go too. After years of nurturing her thirst for knowledge, Sonia was as solid in her intelligence as she was comfortable in her own skin. She could open up and share herself with others, whether it was about her diabetes or with the compelling issues of the day. I think there is some comfort in liking yourself enough to be comfortable in your own world, she said. Sonia's world then revolved around the Bronx, embracing her bicultural New Yorkan life. With a forward-thinking mother guiding her thought, education would lift her as an independent, self-sufficient woman with a purpose that would take her far beyond to another world she only imagined.